Good evening. I'm Warren Hoge, IPI's Senior Adviser for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this Beyond the Headlines event featuring Heraldo Muñoz, author of Getting Away with Murder, Benazir Bhutto's Assassination and the Politics of Pakistan. Heraldo, of course, is a very familiar person in this community because of the 7 years he served as Chile's high-profile ambassador to the UN, and his servants since then as an Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean at UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. But tonight he's here as the author of a carefully researched and grippingly written book being published actually today. December 9th is the publication date in this country, on the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan. She was killed in a suicide bomb attack in December 2007 at a political rally in Rawalpindi, 2 months after she had ended a self-imposed 9-year exile from the country and just 11 days before an election that could have returned her to power. As it turned out, it was Asif Ali Zardari, her husband, who became president of Pakistan in 2008, and in that capacity, he formally asked Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to name a commission to investigate the assassination of his wife. Ban followed up that request by naming Heraldo to chair the three-man panel. The commission produced its report after a year-long inquiry in April 2010, and it garnered a lot of praise internationally for its exhaustive and unbiased nature, two characteristics that various government-commissioned accounts up to that time had notably lacked. In fact, they were whitewashes, and I'm sure Heraldo will tell you later of the interesting circumstances in which he learned of the first one. When government officials attacked the commission report, Ban said he stood squarely behind it. Particularly dismissive was General Pervez Musharraf, the then president of Pakistan and a determined rival of Bhutto's. He said the report proved that Heraldo was no, quote, Sherlock Holmes. Heraldo has spent 2 years writing this book, which he says is his own personal view of the murder of Benazir Bhutto. And he has expanded it into what he calls an examination of political life and death in Pakistan. That broad context is a critical one for looking at the Pakistan that Bhutto was returning to and the dangers it posed to her. The political history that Heraldo chronicles is, in his words, one of unconsolidated democracy, betrayals, corruption, unsolved political assassinations, religious radicalism, and foreign influence. The list of people or groups that could have considered Bhutto an enemy worth eliminating was a long one. It included Al-Qaeda, the Pakistani Taliban, the Musharraf government itself, the notorious military intelligence agency known as the ISI, and the so-called establishment of sections within the army and security services, certain businessmen and Islamist extremists. Bhutto was clearly aware of this because she had written a letter to Musharraf 2 days before her killing with the names of people in Pakistan who she thought were plotting against her. The morning of her assassination, she told Afghan President Hamid Karzai that she was worried that Pakistan's intelligence services were conspiring against her. She had even emailed CNN's Wolf Blitzer, saying that if she were killed, she would, quote, hold Musharraf responsible, unquote. In that connection, Heraldo describes the deeply suspect behavior by the authorities in charge of her security, both before the killing and in its aftermath. There also, of course, had been an organized attempt on her life the day she returned from exile in October, when a bombing of her welcome back caravan left her unharmed, but killed 149 people and injured another 400. Heraldo has a fascinating account of the mounting of that attack and of the steps of the steps Bhutto and her people took to make up for the feckless security she was provided by the Musharraf government. That part of the book and the later almost minute-by-minute reconstruction of the assassination read like a thriller. And maybe this is a good time to mention that copies of the book are for sale at the door. And Heraldo will linger here after we finish at about 7:45 to chat with you and to sign books. Finally, one example of the disturbingly repetitive nature of violence in Pakistani politics is the fact that Bhutto was killed in a Rawalpindi park named for Prime Minister Liaquat Ali, who was assassinated there in 1951. In the kind of anecdotal detail that, frankly, journalists treasure, Heraldo notes that one of the doctors who administered to Bhutto as she lay dying on December 27, 2008, was the son of a doctor who had tried to revive the mortally wounded Liaquat in the same spot 56 years earlier. It always gives me satisfaction to introduce talented writers here at IPI, and it gives me added pleasure this evening to present one who is also a good friend. Heraldo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Warren, and thanks to IPI for inviting me to this book presentation. Thanks to all of you for attending it. As I said, I was in the southern lakes region when I got this phone call from the Secretary General's office. His chef de cabinet asking me whether I would lead this commission to find out about the facts and circumstances of the assassination of Benazir Bhutto. I was thoroughly surprised about that. First, because I was a sitting ambassador, and I couldn't recall any president of a sitting ambassador leading a UN commission. There were many, of course, former ambassadors, former prime ministers, former foreign ministers, but an ambassador in exercise, I couldn't recall any. And second, I thought it was a tremendous issue because investigating the assassination of our former political leader, or the stature of Benazir Bhutto, presented, of course, a tremendous challenge. And in addition, when he explained to me that we wouldn't have a power subpoena, that this would not be a tribunal, that it would be unlike the Hariri investigation, the assassination of the former Lebanese prime minister, I realized that indeed was a challenge. And I said that I needed some time to consult with my president and my foreign minister. And I called my president, President Bachelet at the time, and I explained the request that I had received. And she reacted unlike what I thought she would react. I thought she would say, no, look, this is a bit too delicate, it's too complicated, better say no. And she said, this is very good, that Chile has been chosen for this. It speaks well about our foreign policy, speaks very well about you, about your personal trajectory and your talents, etc. So I had no reason to say to the Secretary General that I wouldn't do it, and despite the complications that I foresaw. And that's how it came about that I became engaged in this inquiry that included two other colleagues and friends that became friends in the process, Marzuki Darusman, who was a former Attorney General of Indonesia, and Peter Fitzgerald, who was the former Deputy Police Chief of Ireland. And aside from a staff that was very competent that helped us. But I thought it was a bit of a lose-lose situation because we wouldn't be an investigation that would establish penal responsibilities. And on the other hand, my perception was that the people in Pakistan and the international public opinion would expect that we would come out with a smoking gun. So I thought this is the worst of the possible worlds, but let's see how far we can do it. The first thing I began to do, and that's how I thought of the book, I began writing it in my head immediately after we finished and delivered it to the Secretary General, which coincided with the end of the Bachelet government. And since I was a political appointee, I stopped having a job as soon as there were elections in Chile that elected an opposition candidate. So I had enough free time in my hands to begin writing notes, and I did. There were long months in which I was unemployed, and I dedicated it to take notes about that. And several people from publishing houses suggested that I should write the book, and I began working on the project. But the first thing I thought, I need to put this in context. And the context of Pakistan was particularly challenging. The political culture of Pakistan, and many of you are Pakistanis and know this better than I, but I learned that very quickly, is a political culture of conspiracies, of disbelief. Warren mentioned some of the elements that lend credence to this attitude of disbelief, of conspiracies. The assassination of Liaquat Ali Khan, the prime minister that succeeded the untimely death of Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, was precisely at the same spot where Benazir Bhutto was assassinated, in Company Bagh, was called at that time in 1951. And the assassination of Liaquat Ali Khan was very important because it was an assassin that fired at him, assassinated him in front of a political rally, just like the one that Benazir had attended when she was killed. And the individual that fired was captured by the people attending the rally. And nevertheless, even though she was captured and the weapon had been taken from him, a sub-inspector came in and shot him 5 times. So we never knew who was behind it. Was he a lone wolf? He was an Afghan who lived in Abbottabad, a place that would become famous later on. And we never know until today. There are conspiracy theories about who killed Liaquat Ali Khan. But there have been many other political assassinations. And there is a beautiful essay by Ali Sethi, a Pakistani writer. He wrote a piece in the New York Times about the terrorist attack against the Sri Lanka national cricket team. And I think it was called Murder Mystery in Lahore, I think it was called the article. It was beautiful because he went to tea stalls in the streets and began asking people, so who do you think did it? And people would say criminals. Another one said the Taliban. The other one said the government. The other one said the intelligence agencies. Someone even said India, you know? I mean, so the idea of conspiracy and disbelief was something that I learned very quickly. And when we finished the report, and I was no longer an ambassador, I was in a subway station with my wife, and we were on the platform waiting for the train, and this individual paced up and down and looked at me very intently. And at times I thought, well, there are some Chilean tourists that come to town, and since I was a minister, I was the official spokesperson for the government, I had a lot of positions that gave me a lot of media exposure. Thought, well, they would recognize me as they have sometimes in the street. But no, he came and he says, are you Ambassador Muñoz of Chile? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, I'm Pakistani, and you are the most wanted person in Pakistan. I said rather nervously, wanted positively or negatively? And he said, no, positively. You did a great report. This was a great service to Pakistan. But you know, he said, nothing will happen. Because in Pakistan, nothing happened. Your investigation will be wasted. I'll tell you, you know, we never end anything. No justice is ever made. And he began getting more and more aroused. And I told my wife, our train is coming, let's move away. So that indicated to me this culture of disbelief, culture of conspiracy, which was part of the context, besides a history of instability, a history where the military had dominated 30 30 years out of the 60 years of independence, more or less, half of the time of many civilian governments haven't finished their time in office, and the intervention then of the military had added this element of instability. This is part of the context. It's a very small part of the context, of course. Another part of the context that I thought was important was the relevance of external actors, particularly the United States. And the Pakistani elite perceived since the very beginning that they had to be allies with the US. In fact, Ali Jinnah said very clearly that you had to be allied with the US, and all his successors thought the same. In fact, even one of the dictators, Ayub Khan, said at one moment to the US, if you want, our army can be your army. And very early, Pakistan joined a lot of the Cold War arrangements. A mutual agreement pact, assistance was signed in 1956. The perception of Pakistan was you had to be allied with the United States. But when a war with India occurred and the United States played the neutrality card, there was a great sense of disappointment on the part of Pakistan. But nevertheless, the U.S. continued to be a major actor, and Pakistan continued to rely on the United States for many aspects. That began to change later on when, I'm talking about the 70s, when Jimmy Carter came in, and a major issue arose with regard to Zia-ul-Haq. And Zia-ul-Haq, as you probably know, was the general whom Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the father of Benazir Bhutto, who had been the great prime minister of Pakistan, the international leader, he was a leader of the third world, without a doubt, a brilliant man. When he became prime minister after the separation of East Pakistan and the havoc that occurred, had appointed Zia-ul-Haq because he thought that he was pliable, that he was manageable. He wasn't the one in the line of command, in the seniority. It so happened that it was Zia-ul-Haq that overthrew Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and actually arranged for him to be hanged, to be killed. So at that moment, relations with the US were not the best. But everything changed when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And then the Carter administration and then the Reagan administration allied with Zia-ul-Haq and his policy of supporting Islamist extremists and mujahideen in the fight against the Soviets, and later on even with the Taliban. So this is an aspect that was absolutely fundamental to understand the investigation into the facts and circumstances. And here it is a Benazir Bhutto who, as an element of the context, had never wanted to be a politician. She had always wanted to be a diplomat. And when she was raised, of course, very much in the Western education, went to a Catholic school, attended Harvard and then Oxford, and he spoke better English than Urdu. And when she came to the United States, her eyes opened. She said it was the first time ever that she'd gone to classes without being driven by a chauffeur. And she began expanding her horizons, but her ideal was to be a diplomat. And she was going to do that. She was going to come to the General Assembly in 1977 and then go back and take the exam for the foreign ministry. And that's when the coup occurred against her father. And then she turned into a political figure. She began to defend her father and her legacy, and she went into politics full force from then on. And it is a tremendous story about her, because here is a woman that, as she said, a daughter of destiny, that she ended up being the first prime minister of a major Islamic country like Pakistan, not only once but twice, but both times dismissed. So this is a bit the context which I wanted to convey in the book, well beyond the investigation, because investigation basically goes into what happened with the day of the assassination and what were some of the elements surrounding that assassination. And of course, we've encountered many surprises. From one thing, every information in our inquiry was leaked. I mean, I'm a political figure, so I served in high posts in Chile, and I know that we don't like when the press, has access to information that is not supposed to access. So leaking is always a preoccupation to political leaders. But in Pakistan, it was just excessive, in my view. When we arrived, the first time the day that we were leaving, my chief of staff tells me that our computers have been hacked, so that all of the information about our trip, somebody has. So he said, I think we should talk to DSS and discuss this, whether we should go or not. I said, look, anybody could have hacked our computers. I said, you're thinking of the bad guys, but there are a lot of bad guys, I said. So, and some of the bad guys may be closer than you think. I said, so let's not worry. Let's just go. And she said, well, should I tell? Yes, tell DSS, but I'm not suspending the trip. So we left, and in the stopover in Dubai, we had a connection with DSS, and they said, we suggest that you don't go beyond the red area of Islamabad. And I said, well, thank you for the suggestion, but I need to go to Rawalpindi. I need to leave Islamabad because for symbolic and for obvious reasons, I have to go to the crime scene. So that was the beginning of it. And we arrived, and we were at Sin House that had been made available to us generously by the Sindh provincial government, because we were not allowed to be in a hotel, no place of public access. So my first surprise was the cook, which was a very affable guy who spoke no English, had a detailed agenda of everything that we were going to do. And I said, how could something so sensitive be in the hands of the cook? And the response was one that was quite rational, but it did not make any political sense for sure, and any security sense. He needed to know when we would be around for meals. So I protested about that, and we felt that we needed to tighten up security, particularly because the press followed us everywhere, So next day we go to Rawalpindi. And I decided to do a little ploy. We wrote in the program that we would go by helicopter in the afternoon the next day, and we ended up going at 5 o'clock in the morning in a caravan of cars. And it was beautiful. There was nobody on the roads. The police helped us to not have any traffic. We arrived in Rawalpindi, and the police have blocked, with all kinds of barriers about 2 blocks away, a perimeter. And but I saw like a group of people in the distance, and the policeman, Peter, my colleague, says to me, "You're looking at that. You know what they are? Look at it. They are journalists. They are cameramen, and they are people with photo cameras to take photograph from the distance." Someone had told the press, and they were there at least 20 or 30 at 5 o'clock in the morning. The same thing happened to me later on at a very sensitive moment. We felt that we needed access to all relevant actors. That was part of the conditions. And I requested in a private letter that we would have access to the head of ISI, General Pasha, and to the head of the army, General Kayani. Instead of responding me privately and in a reserved way as I had done, the Ministry of the Interior, which was our contact person, responded publicly through the press saying the ISI and the army is off limits. They have nothing to do with this. And I responded, I'm sorry, but Benazir Bhutto wrote a letter to Musharraf saying that she felt that there were elements of the establishment, including the former head of the ISI, Mr. Hamid Gul, and the actual head of IB, the Intelligence Bureau, another intelligence agency, Ijaz Shah, and in addition to that, named the head of the provincial government of Punjab, the chief minister. So how could I not have access to these people? But they responded to me through the press, and I said, okay, I won't go back to Pakistan. And I had some friends that I will not name, I didn't name in the book, and I will never name, who helped me a great deal. And they suggested, why don't you write directly to the head of the army? And I said, we don't do that in Chile. I said, we don't do that. We go through regular, conduits. They said, no, do it. And I did it, and all of a sudden, we were giving the interviews. With General Pasha, we went, the three, the commissioners, myself, and to see General Kanyani, I was given special requirements. I was to go see him alone, without my two colleague commissioners, without a convoy, without security, with only one armed UN policeman. And I accepted all of the conditions against the opinion of my security team, against the opinion of my two colleague commissioners. But I said, look, I asked for this. We think that it's important. These are the conditions. I will make the decision to accept. And I did. And it was a very interesting conversation, that one that began very badly, by the way, because I asked him, so how were the conversations between Benazir Bhutto and Musharraf in Abu Dhabi leading to the possible deal for her return? And he says, why you ask me this? And I said, well, I'm asking you this because you were there, And I think this is very important to our report, and you were the head of the ISI when you were there. So that's why I'm asking you. Otherwise, I wouldn't. I thought to myself, we're wasting our time, his time and mine. But then things changed, and it was a very good dialogue. I might say, I felt that both the conversation with the head of ISI and the head of the army were productive. They were helpful. They did not try to tell me stories, and that was, I valued that very much. But going back to the leaking, I go back at night, this was at night, and arrive to our house, and I tell my colleague commissioners what has transpired in this conversation in secret. And next day in the morning, all of the press is saying, Commissioner of Inquiry has met with General Pasha, and the head of the commission, Benazir Muñoz, has met with Kayani. And they had details about, what time and everything. So that made it very difficult to do the work. In the end, we uncovered many contradictions in the facts and circumstances. The local police that, in our view, had made a cover-up, that had washed the scene of the crime 1 hour and 40 minutes after it had taken place, wiping out probably all of the significant evidence that could have been gathered. We spent a day in London speaking to Scotland Yard. They estimated that only 23 pieces were gathered in the scene of the crime. In a scene of the crime like that, of an individual who shoots and then blows himself up, as he did, killing 38 people, there could have been thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence. Only 23 were recovered because of washing up the scene of the crime. And I'm convinced that somebody higher up gave that instruction. I don't think that the local head of police, out of his own volition, did that. And also the not having authorized a autopsy of Benazir Bhutto at the hospital, which was the duty according to Pakistani law. It corresponded to the police to determine to do that. They didn't. And Dr. Musaddiq Khan, who, by the way, as you recall, and I put in the book, some of the coincidences here are just unbelievable. Mossadegh Khan, the son of Dr. Khan, who had attended Liaquat Ali Khan when he had been taken not to the same hospital, because that would have been just too much coincidence, but to the military hospital, and his father tried to revive Liaquat Ali Khan unsuccessfully, Mossadegh Khan unsuccessfully trying to revive Benazir Bhutto and demanding to do an autopsy by being denied. We began discovering all kinds of issues and discovering other issues. And with this, I'll end. We also found that the people around Benazir were not as efficient as they should have been, to say the least. There was a backup car, a bulletproof backup Mercedes in the convoy when they arrived to Liaquat Bag for her to give the speech. And then when the convoy is going to go back, and then is where the attack and the killing occurs, the backup car is nowhere to be seen. Nowhere to be seen. We saw numerous videos. We saw numerous photographs, nowhere to be seen. And we interviewed every single person in every one of the cars that survived. We interviewed the policemen, and nobody sees the backup car, even though they say that they were near 250 yards. I never could get straight answers from Rehman Malik, the Ministry of Interior. Every time we interviewed him about that, about his own presence there, he would say, let's talk later, and we would never be able to wrap up. The point is, they heard the explosion. They continued on instead of being in a convoy. A convoy doesn't depart one vehicle from each other. They went directly to Zardari House, which was Benazir Bhutto's house in Islamabad, which is about 30 minutes, between 25 and 30 minutes. They didn't even stop to find out what had happened, whether she had been injured. And this was the vehicle that was a backup car. It so happened that the vehicle in which Benazir Bhutto was riding, being a B6, stood the explosion sufficiently, but all the tires were blown off, so that they had to ride on the rims, and the vehicle didn't make it to the hospital. It made it halfway. So how did she get to the hospital? Because a leading activist of the PPP was coming in a private car, and so happened to come, and they shifted Benazir to that, wasting enormous valuable time to take to the hospital. So the backup car was not there. All of these things, I think, began to be felt as if we were stepping on toes. And at the beginning, I felt welcome. I felt very supported. The president met us 3 times to talk about what has transpired. The Ministry of Interior, Rehman Malik, met us many, many times. But at the end, I began feeling not as welcome as at the beginning, because we were doing a very independent, in-depth investigation that would not simply be a cosmetic type of report. We wanted to make a bit of a contribution to the death of a woman that would be sorely missed. She was hated by many. She was hated by Al-Qaeda, hated by the Pakistani Taliban, because she was a woman, first of all. She was a Western-educated woman. They called her modernist, too modern. They accused her of being a Shia because her mother was Iranian and of Shia orientation. They accused her of being sold to the United States and the West, and of wanting the straight oversight and control on the part of as it should be in a democracy, of the army and the intelligence services by the civilian government. All of that made her a woman hated by many, but loved also by enormous amounts of people. And I found so many people that, frankly, put their bets on the future of Pakistan on her. At least I'm satisfied that the story ends up relatively well, because perhaps her death made it possible for many to realize that you had to have Zardari, the widower, end up his period. There were moments that were very difficult. Well after our investigation had finished, I remember that Prime Minister Gilani more or less denouncing a possible coup at the end of 2011 and saying the army cannot be a power within a power within the government, and saying that publicly. But it ended well, because this was the first time ever that a full-term president ended his term and handed it over to another democratically elected government, this time presided by Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. And that I think, indirectly, maybe Benazir Bhutto contributed to. Thank you.
Heraldo, I promised in my introduction that you would tell the interesting story of the circumstances under which you discovered that Pakistan had officially investigated it all before you even arrived. Do you remember what happened when you first met Rehman Malik?
Well, it was very surprising when we had the first interview with our contact person, the Minister of the Interior, Rehman Malik. First of all, it was very formal in the structure. Instead of sitting around a table, it was the typical visit where you sit in rows and looking across, and the main authorities in the middle. And he said, well, thank you very much. You know, what you're doing is very important to us. We wanted this, the UN, we trust the UN. And then he handed me a document, which was 70 pages, and it was entitled Investigation into the Assassination of Benazir Bhutto, and it had a subtitle, I can't remember. And it had some of the, a summary of the Scotland Yards, some testimonies of various individuals, background of people that had been arrested, and etc. And he said, this is your report. He said, you know, use it as you see fit. You can change, of course. He said, you can change whatever you want, but here it is, you know, it's all ready for you. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and I just looked at my colleagues, and I said, this person is asking that this would be the report that we would submit, you know, and probably what he wants us is to do tourism, you know. So that was a very much of a surprise to us, and of course, our report had nothing to do with that document.
Heraldo, you've made it clear that your remit, your mandate, was not to point figures, say who did this. But at one point you say, and you've just repeated tonight, it is my belief that the police deliberately botched the investigation. You said that. And then another point you say this, General Musharraf certainly bears political and moral responsibility in the assassination. And you go on to explain why you think that. Why do you think that? And why was that sort of the one conclusion that you felt you could publish? Because in any state, it's a state responsibility to protect its citizens. And not only it is a state responsibility to protect its citizen, but to protect a former prime minister. And a former prime minister that had landed in Pakistan, in Karachi, and as you mentioned, she has had an assassination attempt that had killed about 145 people. And in addition to that, the government knew and had passed on to her a series of threats, credible threats, that she was facing. So that without those elements and with the fundamental responsibility of the state to protect its citizens, and particularly a former prime minister, I think this is a unforgivable type of situation. That's why I think there is a political and moral responsibility. Any penal responsibility, I have no pronouncement, because that's not up to me to say, or to anybody from above, from outside to say. It is up to the Pakistani courts to determine guilt or to exonerate.
I think that one can say, though, that there's a political responsibility, particularly because there was this dialogue that she had when she was visiting the U.S. Congress, and she was, in fact, in the chamber of a U.S. congressman, and she received a phone call from Musharraf, and Benazir, that was in the U.S. Congress, trying to push every possible pressure on Musharraf to provide her the protection that she needed for her return, says to Musharraf, so have you talked to the American authorities? Have they called you? And he said, look, Musharraf says, they can call all they want, but your security depends on the status of our relationship. Your security depends on the status of our relationship. And that is something that has been repeated by the former Pakistani ambassador to the U.S., by many people that were around there. So my feeling here is that there was a political responsibility, even more so because during the investigation we uncovered a memo that had been sent by Musharraf to provincial authorities asking for VVP, very, very important person, security for two other former prime ministers that were allied with Musharraf, but not for Benazir. So she didn't get the protection, she didn't get the security that she was entitled to. And that, I think, is a tremendous responsibility, and that's why my feeling is that I cannot assign penal responsibility, because who am I to say that? But yes, a political responsibility falls on the lap of the government.
I know you actually met her only once. You just talk in the book about the time you were on a panel together many years before. But one of the fascinating things about the book, Heraldo, is the portrait of her that emerges, and particularly what she was anticipating as she went back, and it was somewhat fatalistic. And you tell a story, and it's a story that involves Zal Khalilzad, who, by the way, emailed me yesterday saying he was sorry he could not be here tonight. But you remember the story. It's a chilling story. Can you tell it?
Well, first, Zal Khalilzad and his wife were very supportive of my book, and they provided me many useful comments and a piece of information that I put in the book, because I thought that it was very telling of her mood before returning. They were in a private flight from New York to Colorado, to Aspen, to a conference, and only the three of them were in the plane. This was about 2 months before she returned to Pakistan, and a stewardess came in with freshly baked cookies and offered it to Benazir, and she says, "No, I'm on a diet. I'm trying to lose weight." And then she says, "Bring them over." I said, "What the heck? I'm going to be dead in 2 months anyhow." And that is an expression of black humor that reflected, nevertheless, the mood. I mean, there was sort of a fatalistic sense that she needed to go back. It was her duty. Her family didn't want her to go back. Her closest friend did not. Her political associates understood that she had to go back because otherwise there wouldn't be a possibility for the PPP. Musharraf's deal with her was she would come back after the elections. And in fact, in those talks that never arrived at a final deal, she has said, "Come on New Year's and we'll celebrate New Year's together." But she realized that if she didn't come back in October, who was going to campaign? You need to press the flesh. In politics, you need to do that. You need to be there. So the future of her party, and she thought the future of democracy depended on her going back. And that, I think, that going back, nevertheless, was surrounded by the threats, surrounded by this negative sense, and her fatalistic sense that she was going to meet her destiny going back to Pakistan.
Let me just ask you one last thing, and this is about, again, it's asking you to speculate about her and what she might have done. Her two prime ministerships were not unalloyed successes. I mean, there were problems in both cases. She goes back, and she's going to be a candidate and run an election. She believed at that point that the policies she stood for were civilian rule and democracy, were human rights, a greater oversight on Pakistan's nuclear weapons, negotiations with India, reconciliation with the non-Muslim world, and confrontation with radical Islamists. She hadn't proved the first two times that she could do something as large as that. By the time she goes back, has she grown in stature and power and influence? Could she have accomplished any of those things had she lived and become prime minister?
It's difficult to say. I mean, it's all for our own speculation. But my own speculation would have been that probably she would have been closer to achieving that than ever. I heard from many people that knew her a lot better than I, because I met her one time, and so I could hardly say that I knew her. But people that were friends, even people that were not friends, that were more neutral observers, and they all said that she had become a lot more politically mature. Mm-hmm. She had become a harder worker. She had become less frivolous, because her two governments she was more interested in appearing to govern than to govern. And her implications in corruption is well known. And it seems that this time she had done her homework, and she was better prepared than ever to take on the responsibilities of governing a country like Pakistan. So I feel that she would have probably been more ready. She was touching on very critical issues, in my view. She talked about the need for a Marshall Plan for Pakistan, because she was looking at what are the problems of Pakistan. It's not just the issue of the Taliban and religious extremism. She thought that a lot of it was an issue of development, that the energy crisis, the fact the power shortages, the unemployment, the fact that many companies have moved elsewhere, to Bangladesh or to other places. The fact that in Pakistan, and I read this from one of the main industrialists in Pakistan in an interview in the Financial Times some time ago, saying, well, we don't pay taxes. She said, I want to pay more taxes. We should pay more taxes. So she had a view of economic development as a key that seemed to be a lot more central to her platform than it had been in previous times. In previous times, there was more of the populist strand. Now she seemed to be more politically mature, and I'm glad though that several of the issues that she's talked about, Nawaz Sharif has been trying to implement.
Excellent. I'd love to get some comments and questions. If you just raise your hand, I'll call on you. Maybe I'll take three at once here. First with Ann Phillips in the front. Again, you know the drill. Just please identify yourself and speak in the microphone.
Can you hear me? Yes.
A little louder.
Okay. Thanks very much. That was... What?
I think it's not on.
It's on.
So, then hold it closer.
It's on. Thank you very much for this presentation. Okay. You had quite an experience, which you shared with us, and I'm so glad you did. I read a great deal about the assassination after it occurred, and I've been a follower of hers because she was really quite a captivating figure in many ways. And is this better?
Yeah,
yes.
It is.
Okay. Well, I want to again thank you publicly so everybody here knows how much we appreciate it. My name is Ann Phillips. I'm a member of the board of the International Peace Institute. As I started to say, I read a great deal about the assassination, and I had always been very fascinated with the woman. I mean, she was a very captivating figure in many ways. And so I followed it and read it in great detail. And there was one thing that always bewildered me, and I know you don't have an answer for this, but still I wanted to comment on it, and that is that the more details that you gave us this evening added to this profound sense of bewilderment that I have about her behavior that day, because with her saying in 2 months I'll be dead, and with all of these enemies that she had, and the fear she had, the fact she didn't have enough security and so forth, and people kept warning her, and why did she open the skylight and stand up out of that car, and she made herself a total target? I mean, I'm not really asking you, because I know you don't have an answer, but I find that so bizarre. And I wonder if there was anybody in the car that you might have questioned about that, who might have encouraged her to do it, or whether the environment in the car, whether there were people who were actually involved with the assassination who would encourage her to stand
I want to
up.
expand upon your question.
Yeah.
Actually, if you could talk, because you do so specifically in the book, about the dispute about whether she was shot, whether she hit her head on the hatch as she went down from the blast. Just talk about that. It will answer Anne's question, but just expand upon that.
Yeah. Well, why did she do that? Well, look, she did that for at least half an hour because she came out of the escape hatch before arriving into Liaquat Bag and after. Before arriving, there's little details that tell you a lot. They arrive in the vehicle, in the caravan, and the gates to the parking lot, which is behind the stage where she was going to give her speech, the gates are locked. They're closed. You can imagine that, you have a VIP, it has to go immediately into, the gates are closed, and they had to wait about 5 minutes about finding somebody to open them. Throughout that time, she's out, saying hello, and she does the same coming out. Why did she do it? Because she was a politician. That's why. I mean, I heard the following. I mean, there could never be anybody that could have told her, Benazir, don't come out. Nobody had the authority on her. If she wanted to do something, she would do it. However, in the investigation, there was one person that I will not name who told me, why don't you ask so-and-so whether she said to her, why don't you stand up and yell some slogans. But that's only one person, and I was never able to confirm that. Rather, she decided to do that, and the moment that this happens, she wants to call Nawaz Sharif, because at that time they were allies. They had signed the Charter for Democracy in 2006, and they were both fighting for the same purpose of reinstatement of democracy. So, and she had heard that Nawaz Sharif rally, some people had died in a shootout. So she wanted to call Nawaz Sharif to offer condolences. So she says, I have to call Nawaz Sharif. But first, why don't we shout some slogans? Because the car was not advancing. There were all kinds of people around. Those people around shouldn't have been there if there had been police to push a way out so the caravan would go out. And then she decides to stand up. So she gives the order for to yell some slogans, and she stands up. And the individual shoots 3 rapid shots and then blows himself up. The reason of the cause of death, we asked Scotland Yard to show us all the analysis that they did, where they say that she died because of the explosion hitting her head against the lip of the escape hatch, not against the lever, as I said at the beginning, and no evidence of shots anywhere. And there's nothing of that. And then even the analysis of Scotland Yard, we asked the Netherlands Institute, Forensic Institute, for an opinion, and they backed the analysis by Scotland Yard.
Excellent. I think there was a hand, yes, right there.
Thank you.
And then I'm going to go to a third person.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful evening and the knowledge about your book. I've known her personally.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Salwa Kader. I'm with the U.S. Federation for Middle East Peace. I've met her at the prayer breakfast. She was a very good friend to the fellowship, and in Washington, D.C., that takes place every year. And every year I met her there, and I was very, very fond of her. I have an organization here, and we do a lot of events during the CSW at the United Nations. And she said to me one day, "Aren't you going to ever invite me to come and speak?" And I said, "Of course, I'll be honored." I was very fond of her, to say the least. And that year, I had 3 different events, and 2 of them were the education for Muslim women, and also the part in the government for Muslim women. And I said, "Pick which one you would like to speak at." And she said, "Both of them. And I am coming. And I wanted to talk about this." And so we advertised that, of course, and then, we've had several discussions with her. And I also met her husband when he first came out of jail and came to Washington at that time. But she had the sense of belief that her destiny is what her destiny is. So she didn't take extra precaution. Do you believe in this is what she was about? That, she said, like, this is how my father went, and so on. So I don't know. It's difficult.
Keep that question. Mossad Haider, who is my old colleague from the United Nations and represents the Dawn of Pakistan.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Warren.
A little louder.
I just want to say one thing, that I have met Benazir several times. I've met Benazir several times. One of the things that she did tell me, just to add to some of your knowledge, that she was aware that at one point in time, before 1988 election, 1990 election, Osama bin Laden was sitting in ISI office, offering monies to ISI to have her killed or to make sure that she doesn't get into power. Now, that's one thing. But my question with you is this, that when this commission was formed, before that, one Pakistani ambassador and one foreign secretary lost their jobs because they opposed any United Nations inquiry into Benazir's murder. Now, and then finally they appointed Mr. Zardari appointed Mr. Hussain Harun to come and carry this with him. Now, my question is, do you think that $5 million that Pakistani government gave to the United Nations was worth it for you to investigate? Because ultimately no conclusion has come into this as of yet. We have come to no conclusion. It's a stalemate. And that other thing that you were talking about, Mr. Rahman Malik, the Interior Minister, I remember him over here when the inquiry was going on. He was scared over here. He was scared. He thought that he will be fingered by you, that he ran away with that car, that Mercedes-Benz, along with other people, and that you will be fingering him, that why did he run away? So did that come clearly to you between Rahman Malik, and do you think that, in your opinion, it's worth it for Pakistan government to have spent $5 million for inconclusive, investigation?
Why don't you answer that first, and we'll get to Salwa's question.
Yeah. Okay. There are several questions that Masood has placed about Bin Laden. I knew that the incident and that he had put $10 million. In fact, in the 1990 election to bump her off, and she had put money, in fact, for the National Assembly to dismiss her. So that I'm familiar with. So the story of Bin Laden and Al Qaeda having her on their site is quite old, and it's In regard to opposition to the commission, well, these things as maybe controversial politically. I have nothing to say about that, but I do have though something to say about the money and whether it was worth it. First of all, the budget, and this is since the UN is very transparent, you can find out exactly how much money was spent. The contributions were made by the government of Pakistan, but not all. Government of the US, the UK, Turkey, United Arab Emirates were the ones that contributed. We did not spend not even a third of the money that you're talking about, and we returned all the rest of the money, and the UN probably knows what happened, whether that was delivered back to Pakistan and the other donors, I have no idea. But you can find out because transparency on these issues is fundamental. By no means is the amount that you said, and that money was not solely put by Pakistan. Whether it was worth it, it's up to the Pakistanis to evaluate, to public opinion to evaluate. You never know. But what I was pleased about, it was that many relevant political actors in Pakistan reacted very positively to it. But more importantly than that, a case was opened by an anti-terrorist court in Rawalpindi, as you know, that began based on the report and going much further than that to try to investigate exactly what had happened, and ended up indicting President Musharraf. As you well know, among one of the 4 cases that he's got is the Benazir Bhutto case. And in addition to that, the government at the time sanctioned the head of the Rawalpindi police and the deputy, Zaud Aziz and Kuram. And in addition to that, there were other sanctions, including to Brigadier Chima, who was the one who had gave the announcement less than 24 hours after the assassination, naming who had done it, and second, how she had died, and less than 24 hours after the fact. So there were a lot of consequences, and I think there were a direct effect of the report's contents. But in the end, again, this was a report about the facts and circumstances. This was a limited report, and it was up to the Pakistani judicial system and political system to take the measures that they deem appropriate.
I have to get the microphone back because you won't be heard on we're webcasting this, and unless you speak in the microphone, it won't be heard.
My follow-up is, because I asked this question, did you see at any point in time Interior Minister Rahman Malik being worried about the investigation as it was going on, as I sensed when he came here, when he was asking me a question? Do you see him worried about the investigation, and did he mention that to you? Because he mentioned that to me over here.
Yeah, I don't know whether he was worried or not. I mean, I admire Rahman Malik because his capacity of work is just unbelievable. I never seen a government official work so much as he had. Sometimes we would meet at midnight, and it would be 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the morning, and we would end, and we would be dead tired. And then at breakfast at 8:30 in the morning, he would be fresh and ready to go, and we would be crawling because of jet lag and sleeping less time than needed. But I can't say that I saw him worried about that. But what I can say is that we asked him repeatedly about clarifying his role the day of the assassination, about what had happened with the vehicle. He never clarified that to us. It was other people that responded our questions. But aside from that, I can't say anymore.
Do you have any reaction to Salwa's, if your impression of her was the same as hers?
Yeah, well, again, I think that she had this sense of duty that commanded her returning to Pakistan. That was above all. It's something that I connected very well with, because I was in a similar situation. I fought a dictatorship. I went underground, and my wife is here, and I owe her many apologies every time I remember about this, how I put her in danger, because I thought that despite that my security would be at risk, I would fight the dictatorship. So I thought, sometimes you're young and you think that there are higher values, but there are higher values, and some people take risks. And I did, and I felt that she was taking risks that I understood why she was taking them. I mean, in a rational sense, if you want to live a quiet life, you do that. That's a choice. But you choose a political career, and if you have strong values about your country, you would sometimes go beyond the limits. And in that sense, I understood why she was doing it for.
I'll take one last round. Jeff Laurenti here on the left, and a third. A third here. Very good. First, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you, Warren. Jeff Laurenti. I wonder, by the way, Heraldo, if you might expand a little bit about where you saw kind of déjà vu as you were looking into Pakistan between that and your experience under the Pinochet dictatorship of the military and intelligence and the willingness of people to fight back. I hope, since you raised that, it would be worth hearing you expand on that a little bit. The question I wanted to pose to you is to ask what contact you or your team may have had with any of the extremist Islamist groups circulating in Pakistan, some of which have been known to have been sponsored by or having relationships with elements of the military, of the intelligence establishment, or whether you only had second or third-hand information about them, no direct contact with anybody in that ultra-Islamist milieu, and what sense you had as you pursued your inquiry that those groups were being used by either military or other elements of the Pakistani security state to be turned not just against India or Afghanistan, but also against domestic opponents, political opponents.
I think before I go to the other two questions, answer that, and also, would you also describe the famous strategic depth policy, which I think responds to what Jeff is asking?
Well, as regards the parallels between dictatorship in Chile and Pakistan, there were some elements that seemed to me so familiar because they are of the nature of a dictatorship. When we interviewed Musharraf, and many of the explanations that I heard from people that served with Musharraf were exactly what I heard from Pinochet, and when Pinochet was on trial. The standard line is, look, I was president of the country. I was not in the day-to-day repression. I had no idea what the intelligence services were doing. I was just the president. And you can imagine a dictator has a hold on power, and they know what's going on. In fact, Pinochet had said, there's not a sheet of paper that is turned in Chile without me knowing about it. And Musharraf, more or less the same. He was on top. He was a very hands-on president, a dictator. So that there were similarities in that sense. There were many others, but it would be too long to and I don't want to get into Chile. We have presidential elections in a week and all that. Contact with extremists, no, evidently we didn't do. We didn't have any. I mean, you had to find them first. The first visit that we were there, one of our members of the staff was a journalist, and he said, look, you had to do a press conference because the pressure of the press is so strong that you have to. And we did. And the only aggressive question that we got was one guy that said, so, are you going to interview Baitullah Masood? You know? And I said, if we were willing and we could find them, you know, I mean, what else could I say, you know? But we did interview people that were supposed to be sort of spokespersons for. We spoke to a senator that had denied on behalf of Baitullah Masood that he was bent on attacking Benazir Bhutto. He denied that. And then he also denied that it was his voice in a recording that Brigadier Chima in that press conference 24 hours later showed us evidence that it was Baitullah Masood talking to an associate to congratulate him on a job well done. So we spoke to people that were supposedly close. Were they representative is difficult for me to evaluate, but it was as close as we could have, at least to find out about the versions of Baitullah Masood and the TTP being involved.
Okay. And then the third. These will be the last two questions.
Thank you so much for your talk. I run UNICEF's Leadership Academy, and I think, based on what you were talking about, you have now a quite intimate understanding of her as a person and her as a leader. So my question to you is about her leadership. And from what you've gathered in your own intimate opinions and knowledge, what do you think her greatest leadership strength was, and what was probably her greatest leadership flaw?
Mm-hmm. Fine. And then finally here in the second row.
Yes, Rhonda Haubin, and I have an online column at the tots.de website, which is the Detagazon website. My question is, what do you think is needed at this point to go further from where you've gotten to and where the investigation has gotten to? And there's two other parts to it. What is your hope for the book with respect to all of this? And then do you have any hope for the internet and the netizens taking this up and being able to make further progress in terms of being helpful?
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of her leadership, I think it's undoubtedly she was a flawed leader. She was often more interested about the glamour of being a leader, of being recognized as such in the West, than about leading and taking the hard decisions that you need to take when you lead. And you're going to dissatisfy a lot of people. And I think that her two periods were characterized by that. At the same time, I think she was realistic enough to realize that in politics you had to negotiate, and sometimes the ideal is enemy of the good. And that's why she understood, against the wishes of the PPP, that she had to negotiate with Musharraf, that she had to swallow a lot of unsavory issues that she would have not wanted to do it as a purist. So she was enough of a politician to know that. And in fact, that put a lot of distance between her and one of her brothers, Mir Murtaza, who was of the view that you didn't negotiate with the dictatorship, and you didn't accept the limited conditions that she was put into to accede in 1988 to the post of prime minister. And in fact, he ended up breaking relations with her and creating an own party, because she was a politician. I clearly understood the type, going back to the parallels, the challenges that we had in Chile. Do you fight a dictatorship with arms? And that was the idea of Mir Murtaza and Shanawaz, the two brothers. You had to resist by arms. And she understood that you don't defeat a dictatorship that has all the power of the armed forces behind. You had to mobilize social mobilization, political mobilization, but do it peacefully. And that forces you to concede a lot. And that was, I think, a strong aspect that she had. Obviously, another weak aspect, going back to the weak, is the corruption. Clearly, there was, I don't need to go into that. There's enough evidence that she was involved in corruption. And there's a very nice interview, people don't know it very well, that appeared one time in The Guardian, where she sort of recognizes that her father, her husband is not a saint, and there's issues, that he associates with unsavory characters, and it is the closest to recognizing that there was, admitting corruption. So that was part of the. But every leader is flawed. There's no. I mean, today we're hearing about Mandela, about all the good things, but every leader is flawed. I mean, if you're looking for a saint to lead a country, you're never going to find it. You're always going to find weaknesses, but all in all, I think she was a committed Democrat, and she had passion about what she had to do. At least she convinced me about that. The few minutes that I had a conversation with her. The other question is about what is needed.
What's needed, and then what the book does, and then the third.
Well, about the book, that's something I had to do. So that's for you to judge. I have no specific pretensions. I just wrote it, and I think I had to do it. What is needed is for the road of democracy to continue and to tackle some of the challenges that are pending, that she signaled, and for the courts to decide. Look, I thought very much when writing this book about the question that a lot of people have asked me. So who did it? I mean, there's a lot of people that tell me that. And the only thing that I came up with is a metaphor. There's this play called Fuente Ovejuna. It's a Spanish play. It's an old Spanish play, Fuente Ovejuna. Fuente Ovejuna is the name of a town. And the story is about the administrator of the town is a very hated individual, and he's assassinated one day. And a judge comes in from outside to investigate the assassination, and he begins interviewing every one of the villagers and asking who did it. And every single villager says, Fuente Ovejuna did it. The village did it. And he goes, one after the other, there's no villager that says anything different but Fuente Ovejuna did it. And he even gets so upset, so mad, that he even has some of them tortured, and they continue to say Fuente Ovejuna did it. And I thought, well, in the case of Benazir, it's sort of Fuente Ovejuna did it. I mean, it was the village did it because it was Al-Qaeda that had branded her as a target. It was the Pakistani Taliban that executed the act, because nobody buys that a 16-year-old, actually the suicide bomber was 15 and a half years old. Nobody buys that he would do it alone. So, but the Pakistani Taliban, the police did a cover-up. Musharraf didn't protect her, didn't, according to what she was entitled to, and in a sense facilitated it. The US and the UK promoted her return, but would not take charge of her security, and that they recommended that she hire Blackwater services, and it cost her. They gave her an estimate of $400,000 a month, but then Musharraf said no foreign agents. The people around her failed her own leading security team, not the guys, not the young men that exposed their lives, but the actual leadership of her security team failed her. And in the end, my perception was a lot of the Pakistani actors would rather turn the page than continue to delve into the issue. So in a sense, the village did it in. There were too many people that wanted her out, that wanted assassinated. But in the end, what is needed is up to the courts, up to the judicial system of Pakistan to determine that. One little anecdote: the state prosecutor in the Rawalpindi anti-terrorist court case was assassinated 6 months ago. The one that was having charge of the Benazir Bhutto case.
Heraldo, it's a fascinating story, well told in the book. Books are for sale in the back. Heraldo's going to stay here to sign them and chat with you. And I want to thank you for coming here.
Thank you for inviting me.